4 people stepped into the wilderness, none of them returned the same way. In Arizona, veteran outdoorsman William Anthony Ott vanished without leaving a trace. In Yosemite, Kirk Thomas Olson set out on a familiar trail, only for his body to be found weeks later, with no answers about how he died. At the Grand Canyon, 20-year-old Leticia Castillo disappeared, her fate discovered below the rim in a week of devastating tragedies. And in 2002, Walter Reinhard walked into Yosemite's backcountry and was never seen again. These are not just accidents. They are mysteries carved into the silence of America's wildest places. And the question that lingers is chilling. When the wilderness takes someone, does it ever give them back? In April of 2012, a seasoned outdoorsman set out on what was meant to be a 3-week solo trek through some of the most remote and unforgiving terrain in Arizona. He carried only his backpack, his knowledge of the wild, and a quiet confidence built over decades of experience. But he never came back. More than 10 years later, the land has offered no answers, only silence. This is the story of William Anthony "Bill" Ott, and the questions that still linger around his disappearance. William Anthony "Bill" Ott was 65 years old when he vanished. To those who knew him, he was a man shaped by independence and resilience. He lived in Oregon and spent much of his life venturing into wild places where most people would hesitate to go. For Bill, the wilderness wasn't a backdrop for recreation. It was where he felt most at home. Friends described him as experienced and resourceful, someone who thrived in challenging environments. Years of hiking and exploration had tested his endurance, sharpened his instincts, and made him comfortable in conditions that might overwhelm others. So when, in the spring of 2012, Bill announced his plan to take on a 3-week solo hike through the Hualapai Indian Reservation, few who knew him were surprised. The Hualapai lands, bordering the Grand Canyon, are vast and rugged. Canyons carved deep into the desert floor, cliffs that fall away without warning, and stretches of barren land where water is scarce. For most, it would be daunting. For Bill, it was the kind of challenge he seemed to welcome. He carried with him a gray backpack, trimmed with black and blue. Beyond that, little is known about the exact gear he packed. What is certain is that he had chosen this trek deliberately, perhaps seeking solitude, perhaps testing himself once more against the wilderness he respected so deeply. On April 5th, 2012, Bill was dropped off at his starting point. That moment would become the last confirmed sighting of him. His plan was simple in structure, if not in execution. Spend 3 weeks hiking through remote country, then return on April 28th. But April 28th came and went. There was no sign of him. No message, no arrival. At first, there may have been hope that he had simply been delayed, as experienced hikers sometimes are. Days passed, and then weeks. Concern turned slowly into alarm. Finally, when he was 12 days overdue, the situation was no longer possible to dismiss. Bill was reported missing in mid-May. By then, however, precious time had already slipped away. Search and rescue officials mobilized, working alongside the Coconino County Sheriff's Office. The search area was immense and unforgiving. The Hualapai lands are not only remote, but also punishing to navigate. Sharp cliffs, dry desert expanses, and dramatic drops into the Grand Canyon itself. For rescuers, conditions were harsh. Heat by day, cold by night, and the isolation that comes with such a vast landscape. Despite their efforts, no sign of Bill was ever found. Not his pack, not a trail of belongings, not even a clue that might suggest where he had gone. It was as though the land had swallowed him whole, keeping its secrets beyond human reach. More than a decade has now passed since Bill disappeared. On September 27, 2016, his case was officially entered into NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, where it remains unsolved. What could have happened? Investigators and those who have studied his case point to several possibilities, each sobering in its own way. Perhaps Bill suffered an accident, a fall into a canyon, or an injury in a place too remote for help to arrive. Perhaps he faced a medical emergency, a sudden illness that left him unable to continue. Environmental dangers are ever present in such terrain: dehydration, heat exhaustion, or exposure to the elements. Wildlife encounters, while less common, cannot be ruled out. Another possibility is disorientation. In an area so vast and so similar in appearance from ridge to ridge, even the most experienced hiker can lose their bearings. A wrong turn could have taken him far from his intended route, into a place where rescue teams could never reach. What makes this case unusual is the total absence of evidence. There were no footprints, no dropped equipment, no trail left behind to follow. There was also no sign of foul play. The investigation uncovered no reason to believe that anyone else was involved. Instead, what remains is a profound uncertainty, one that weighs most heavily on his family. For them, the hardest part has not been knowing he is gone, but not knowing how or why. Closure is impossible when the questions remain open, and when every possibility leads to a different imagined outcome. The disappearance of William Anthony Bill Ott is more than just a story of one man lost in the wilderness. It is also a reminder of the delicate balance between human ambition and nature's indifference. The wilderness offers beauty and challenge, but it also demands respect, for even the most skilled can find themselves at its mercy. As we reflect on Bill's story, we're left with questions that may never be answered. What happened in those weeks after he stepped into the desert? Where did his path ultimately lead? And perhaps most importantly, what does his disappearance teach us about the mysteries that still linger in the places where civilization ends and wilderness begins? In August of 2024, an experienced hiker set out into Yosemite National Park, prepared for what should have been a familiar challenge. He left behind careful plans, a note detailing when he would return, and decades of experience in the outdoors. But he never came back. More than 3 weeks later, his body was found. What happened in those silent days between his departure and his discovery remains a mystery. This is the story of Kirk S. Thomas Olsen and the unanswered questions surrounding his final journey. At 61 years old, Kirk Thomas Olsen was not a man stepping into the wilderness unprepared. He had built much of his life around nature, its quiet rhythms, its challenges, and its beauty. A former park ranger and a longtime employee of California State Parks, he carried with him not only skill, but also a deep respect for the land. To those who knew him, he was confident yet careful, the kind of outdoorsman who understood that experience is only part of survival in the backcountry. That week, Kirk left his home in San Luis Obispo, California, and traveled to one of the most celebrated and demanding landscapes in America, Yosemite National Park. Known for its granite walls, alpine lakes, and sweeping valleys, Yosemite attracts millions of visitors each year. But for all its beauty, the park is also unforgiving. Its terrain challenges even seasoned hikers with steep climbs, unpredictable weather, and trails that stretch far beyond sight. Kirk's chosen route was the Ostrander Lake area, a backcountry trail that forms a strenuous 11.4-mile loop. The hike is not the longest in the park, but it is one that demands stamina. It gains 1,500 feet in elevation, winding through meadows and forests before opening onto views of granite domes that rise above the landscape. For many hikers, this loop can take 8 to 10 hours to complete. For Kirk, it was the kind of challenge he had faced many times before. Before setting out, he did something wise. He left a note on his vehicle, stating the dates he planned to return. It was the kind of precaution that showed his knowledge and respect for the wilderness. But as the days passed, the note remained. Kirk did not return. And soon, the forest that he had entered so confidently became the center of a troubling mystery. It wasn't until mid-September that rangers discovered the note still resting on his car. By then, Kirk was more than 2 weeks overdue. For park officials, this was no small delay. Search and rescue operations began immediately. Teams spread out across the rugged terrain, following trails, scanning ridges, and checking the backcountry routes around Ostrander Lake. Meanwhile, word of Kirk's disappearance reached his family. His niece, Holly Leeson, turned to the public for help. On social media, she shared his story, describing him as an experienced hiker, someone who knew the risks of the outdoors, but also respected its challenges. Still, her words carried the weight of disbelief. How could her uncle, a man who had built his life in nature, vanish in a place he seemed to know so well? For more than 20 days, the search continued. Volunteers, rangers, and officials all hoped for a sign, a clue, something that could explain what had happened. But the wilderness held its silence. Then, in mid-September, the news came that the family had dreaded. Kirk's body had been found. The National Park Service confirmed the discovery, but provided no additional details about the circumstances of his death. Where exactly he was located, what condition he was found in, or what caused his passing. Those questions were left unanswered. For his family, it was the end of weeks of uncertainty. But it was not the end of the questions that lingered in their minds. In the days following, Kirk's family expressed both gratitude and grief. They thanked the Yosemite Rangers who had searched tirelessly and the many people who had offered support. But they also used their loss to share a reminder that experience alone does not eliminate risk. As Holly wrote, Mother Nature in all of her glory does not account for past experience, and solo hiking is never an endeavor that is without risks. Her words carried a sobering truth. Even the most skilled hikers cannot predict every hazard. A misstep, sudden weather, or an unseen health issue can change everything in an instant. Statistics reflect the danger. Between 2014 and 2019, the National Park Service recorded 98 deaths in Yosemite. The leading causes were unintentional: falls, drowning, sudden exposure to the elements. Yosemite is a place of immense beauty, but it is also one of power, where human skill meets natural unpredictability. For Kirk's family, he will never be remembered as part of a statistic. He will be remembered as a man who loved the outdoors deeply, who dedicated his career to parks and natural spaces, and who found meaning in the wilderness. His passing, though, leaves behind questions that may never be answered. What happened in those final days? Did he suffer a fall? Was it sudden illness? Or was it simply the harshness of the wilderness itself? The details remain unknown, but the lesson his story leaves is clear. Nature demands respect, no matter how experienced we are. Solo journeys carry risks that preparation alone cannot erase. And so, as we reflect on Kirk's final hike, we are left with both admiration for his lifelong love of the outdoors and a reminder of its dangers. His story is one of respect, mystery, and the delicate balance between human determination and nature's unpredictability. What do you believe happened out there in Yosemite? In the heart of northern Arizona lies one of the most breathtaking sights on Earth, the Grand Canyon. A vast chasm carved by the Colorado River over millions of years. It stretches for 277 miles and plunges more than a mile deep. For generations, it has been a place of wonder, drawing visitors from across the globe who stand at its rim in awe. But alongside its beauty comes danger. The canyon is as unforgiving as it is majestic, with sheer cliffs, unstable edges, and weather that can change without warning. Rangers remind visitors again and again, one wrong step can have devastating consequences. In early August of 2024, those warnings became reality in the most tragic way. Within just 1 week, 3 lives were lost inside the canyon. Among them was 20-year-old Leticia Castillo, a young woman from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Leticia entered the park on or around August 3rd, 2024. She was 20 years old, full of promise, and like millions of others before her, she came to the Grand Canyon to experience its beauty. But after her arrival, days passed with no word from her family or friends. Concern quickly grew, and a multi-day search was launched by the National Park Service. Rangers know the canyon's dangers well. Every year, visitors underestimate the distances, the terrain, or the heat. Searches are difficult. Its steep walls and vast interior make rescue efforts complex and dangerous, even for trained professionals. On August 6th, the search came to an end. Leticia's body was discovered 150 feet below the twin overlooks along Desert View Drive. The site is known for its sweeping vistas of the canyon, but also for its steep drops, where just a small misstep can lead to tragedy. Leticia's death was heartbreaking on its own, but it was part of a larger pattern in a single, devastating week. By the time Leticia was found on August 6th, the canyon had seen 3 deaths in less than 1 week. Each case was different. One an accidental fall, another a prohibited extreme sport, and one still under investigation. But together, they underscored a sobering truth. The Grand Canyon, as beautiful as it is, can turn deadly in an instant. The circumstances of Leticia Castillo's death remain uncertain. Investigators from the National Park Service and the Coconino County Medical Examiner's Office continue to piece together the timeline of her final days. Whether it was an accidental fall, a moment of disorientation, or something else entirely is not yet known. What is clear is that the Grand Canyon demands caution and respect. Rangers issue constant warnings about the risks: unstable footing, dizzying drops, extreme heat, and the deceptive nature of its terrain. Even well-prepared visitors can find themselves in danger. For Leticia's family, the loss is deeply personal. A cousin remembered her as someone who could light up any room she entered, and tributes online spoke of a young woman full of energy and warmth, whose absence leaves an emptiness that cannot be measured. The canyon itself remains silent. Its walls do not reveal what happened in those final moments. Investigators will continue their work, but much about Leticia's last days may never be fully understood. As we reflect on these losses, the question lingers: how can a place so breathtaking also be so unforgiving? The Grand Canyon is both a wonder of the world and a place of constant risk. It offers inspiration and adventure, but also demands vigilance, preparation, and respect. What are your thoughts? Should more be done to protect visitors in parks like the Grand Canyon? Or does the responsibility ultimately rest with each of us who choose to step close to its edges? In the fall of 2002, Yosemite National Park was quietly shifting seasons. The height of summer had passed, and with it, the bustling crowds that normally filled its campgrounds and trails. By September, the high country was growing cooler, the air sharpening as the days grew shorter. For visitors who preferred solitude, it was an inviting time to explore the park's backcountry. On September 19th, one of those visitors was Reinhard, a 66-year-old man who arrived at the White Wolf Trailhead. White Wolf is not one of the park's most famous spots, but it is a gateway into miles of rugged wilderness, dense forests, granite cliffs, and trails that stretch far from the safety of main roads. It is the kind of place where a hiker can truly feel alone with nature. Reinhard stood about 5'8" and weighed around 145 pounds. His brown hair was graying and thinning with age, and he often wore a distinctive gray alpine-style hiking hat. Friends knew him as someone who favored practicality, often carrying a large fanny pack rather than a heavy backpack. He seemed to value simplicity in his gear, trusting his knowledge of the outdoors to guide him. Though little has been publicly shared about his personal life, what is known paints the picture of a man who found peace in walking trails and spending time in wild places. Hiking wasn't just recreation for Reinhard, it was part of his rhythm, a way to ground himself in the beauty of natural landscapes. That morning, he set out as countless hikers had before him, calm, steady, and prepared for what he believed would be another day in the wilderness. But unlike so many others, his footsteps would never circle back. That trailhead would become both his point of departure and the final trace of his known life. At first, Reinhard's absence didn't cause alarm. In national parks, it is not uncommon for hikers to return late or even extend a trip by a day or two. But as time passed, unease began to grow. By September 30th, 11 days after Reinhard was last seen, his vehicle was discovered still parked at the White Wolf Trailhead. It hadn't moved since the morning he began his hike. That detail changed everything. It confirmed that Reinhard had set out on foot, but never made it back. The National Park Service quickly opened an investigation. Search and rescue teams fanned out across the area, working against the challenges that White Wolf presents. The terrain there is difficult. Thick forests obscure sightlines, and trails can vanish into rocky outcrops. Valleys drop steeply, and sudden weather shifts can turn a safe path into a dangerous one. For even a seasoned hiker, the environment demands caution. Despite coordinated efforts, no sign of Reinhard was ever discovered. Searchers found no clothing, no equipment, no makeshift shelter, nothing to suggest where he had gone or what had happened. The silence of the trail remained unbroken. This absence of evidence was perhaps the most unsettling part. In many missing hiker cases, searchers find at least a trace, footprints, a water bottle, or some indication of a direction taken. For Reinhard, there was none. It was as if the forest had simply closed in behind him, erasing the path he walked. More than 2 decades have passed since Reinhard disappeared, and the mystery remains unsolved. His family, as well as the wider Yosemite community, were left without answers. Only the lingering ache of uncertainty. Investigators found no evidence to suggest foul play. There was also nothing to indicate Reinhard intended to vanish of his own accord. The simplest explanation remains the most likely, that he became lost or injured in a landscape known for its unforgiving character. Yosemite is breathtaking, but it is also merciless. A single miscalculation, a wrong turn, a moment of exhaustion, or a fall on uneven ground can have irreversible consequences. And once a person is injured or disoriented, the vastness of the park makes rescue incredibly difficult. In such conditions, even the most experienced search teams face long odds. The forest has a way of keeping its secrets. Fallen leaves cover trails, streams carry objects away, wildlife and weather erase signs of human presence. For those who vanish in Yosemite, silence is often the only clue left behind. Today, Reinhard's case remains open. Official records list him as lost or injured in Yosemite, his fate unresolved. For many, his disappearance is more than a tragic story. It is a reminder of the fragile balance between adventure and risk. National parks inspire awe, but they also command respect. And so the question lingers: what truly happened to Reinhard on that September day in 2002? Was it a simple accident, hidden by the vastness of the wilderness? Or was there some other circumstance we may never uncover? We may never know. But his story remains part of the long history of mysteries woven into Yosemite's landscape, a history that continues to remind us how small we are against the power of nature. What do you think happened to Reinhard? Was this the story of an experienced hiker caught in a moment of misfortune, or something deeper, concealed within Yosemite's wild expanse?